June 16th, 2024. It's a date of revival in North Philadelphia, though at first glance it looks like the opposite, a blast from the past in almost every conceivable way. In reality, it's actually both. The blast from the past should be obvious just by looking at what we're riding on today. Your eyes do not deceive you. This is a streetcar from the late 1940s. Yes, this is running. Yes, this is in the city of Philadelphia. Yes, this is in the year 2024. And yes, this is in revenue service. So, how is this a revival? Especially if it's not a heritage trip like you'd be forgiven for initially thinking? Well, what if I were to tell you that this trolley and the line that it's running along today on Girard Avenue has not been running for over 4 years until today? If that ain't a curiosity of a case, well, it's but the tip of the iceberg of the story of triumph, downfall, tragedy, and farce that is the story of Philadelphia's famous trolleys. It's a story that ought to be told as a new age of Philly's trolleys dawns on us. And after years of despair, doom, and gloom, it's quite possible that this line, Route 15, serves as the harbinger of a renaissance for the beloved trolleys plying the city of brotherly love. Grab yourself a cheesesteak and a water ice, because this is going to be quite the tale. So, where to begin? Well, I suppose it will be prudent to start from the beginning, which only makes sense. The trolleys of Philadelphia can trace their origins back to 1858 with the first horse-drawn trolley lines spreading throughout the city, particularly what is now the Old City and Center City. To make a very long story short, their operations initially started with each line being run by a separate enterprise. But as would be common with the big mainline railroads of the time as well, a trend of consolidation would begin through the latter half of the 1800s, beginning with the individual companies partaking in what you might call co-opetition with each other, then the companies themselves beginning to merge, then merge some more, and merge even further, until eventually the three largest companies that remained, the Philadelphia Traction Company, the Electric Traction Company, and the People's Traction Company, this one owned Route 15 by the way, would merge to create the Union Traction Company in 1895, unifying Philly's trolley network. In that same near 50-year time frame, the technology behind trolleys had improved dramatically, from the original horse-drawn trolleys into a failed foray into steam-powered trolleys in the 1860s and 70s, which must have been hell to work on, followed by a perhaps better but also failed attempt at popularizing cable cars in the 1880s. Yes, that's the same kind of cable cars you see in San Francisco, until by the 1890s, all the lines would begin to switch to what nearly all trolleys around the world run on to this day, electricity coming from overhead wires. In 1902, the Union Traction Company would be leased by the newly formed Philadelphia Rapid Transit Company, or PRT, which soon after its incorporation and takeover of Philly's trolley routes would begin construction of Philadelphia's first metro rail line, the Market Street Elevated, the first section of the famous, or infamous probably these days, Market Frankford line, which would begin service between 69th Street and 15th Street in 1907. However, the year before the L saw its first run, another equally long-lasting project had been completed right in the L's shadow. Literally. In 1906, a streetcar tunnel was completed under Market Street so that trolleys coming from points in West Philadelphia could enter a tunnel and skip traffic in the area, with the tunnel that we know today after a major rebuild in the 1950s, starting with a portal at 40th Street at the intersection of 40th, Woodland Avenue, and Baltimore Avenue, as well as a second portal at 36th and Ludlow Streets near University City, before passing under the Schuylkill River to an underground loop around Philadelphia City Hall, leading to, frankly, one of the most confusing junction stations I've ever been in and the subject of a future video. Though nobody could know it at the time, this tunnel almost single-handedly would be a saving grace for Philly's trolleys in the years to come. More on that later. Now at this point, I think it would be good to mention the star of our show today, Route 15. But just before I do, it's worth pointing out that while Philly used to be crisscrossed by trolley lines and is now whittled down to 6 in the city and 2 going out to the suburbs, this doesn't count, the majority of SEPTA's bus lines in Philadelphia proper can trace their origins and even their route numbers back to the original trolley lines that the buses replaced. So with that said, what about Route 15? Route 15 is definitely one of the older trolley lines in Philly. Founded as a horse car line in 1859 by the Richmond and Schuylkill River Passenger Railway, Route 15, originally known simply as the Girard Avenue line, guess why, starts at a loop at Girard Avenue and 63rd Street on the border between the neighborhoods of Haddington and Carroll Park, near its depot between Callowhill Street and Vine Street in Haddington. The route then travels along Girard through Mill Creek and Cathedral Park, where the line crosses Lancaster Avenue and connects with another trolley route, Route 10 of the subway surface lines, and then to Parkside, where it passes the Philadelphia Zoo. After the zoo, it then crosses the Schuylkill River into Fairmount, where Girard briefly becomes College Avenue, and the line serves the Girard College Magnet School. As College Avenue becomes Girard again, the line serves Brewerytown and Cecil B. Moore, during which it crosses Broad Street and thus connects with the Broad Street Line subway, before continuing east through Yorktown, Poplar, Ludlow, the Northern Liberties, and Old Kensington, where after the line crosses Front Street and connects with the aforementioned Market Frankfurt L, the line has a junction where Girard Avenue meets Frankfurt Avenue. Here, certain trips of the 15 deviate down Frankfurt Avenue to the popular neighborhood of Fishtown before turning around at the Frankfurt and Delaware Avenue loop near the Rivers Casino on the Delaware River before heading back up to Girard again. Back on the main line, most trips continue along Girard through Fishtown until it passes under Interstate 95 where Girard Avenue ends. From here, the line turns left onto Richmond Street, heading into the neighborhood of Port Richmond, where the line ends at the Richmond-Westmoreland Loop, where it connects with 2 other bus routes, the 60 and the 73. Speaking of connections, not only does this route serve a busy corridor along Girard Avenue, and connecting with 2 of SEPTA's heavily used rapid transit lines, the Market Frankfurt and the Broad Street line, as well as the Route 10 subway surface trolley, but one can make connections with 28 different bus lines going to many parts of the city, with service on the 15 route itself being every 15 minutes most of the day and every 10 minutes at rush hours. With that route in mind, it's obvious that the 15 serves as a vital east-west connection across North Philadelphia on one of the city's most famous main roads, and it's one that's certainly worthy of the benefits that being run as a trolley service would entail. But the obvious question remains, why is it that this service has not been run as a trolley for over 4 years until now? And when it does run, it's run with these trolley cars that, while they are beautiful, they're comfortable, and they run very well, it doesn't really disguise the fact that they're rebuilds of cars that were first made back when Harry Truman was president. So, how did we get to this point? Well, sadly, this is where things start to get just a little bit complicated. By the turn of the 1930s, the flaws of the Philadelphia Rapid Transit Company, or PRT, were becoming more apparent by the day. After grandiose ambitions to expand their elevated and subway rapid transit lines would ultimately come to naught following a financial shortfall for the city after the ill-fated 1926 World's Fair, with the only result being the opening of the Broad Street line in 1929, along with the financial shenaniganry that brought the PRT, which it's worth pointing out was a private company at this point, to its highs in the 1920s, would bring it to its lows by the time the Great Depression hit. By that time, the company had already been up for sale by its owners for 2 years, and after investigations came a-knocking, the PRT's president, Thomas Mitten, was found dead, drowned in a lake near his summer house in the Poconos. The company would struggle along for the next decade until 1940, when it was merged with several other transit companies in the region to form the Philadelphia Transportation Company, or PTC. While the PTC did have more oversight and better union participation than the PRT did, the PTC was still at its core a private company. And what's more, a racially motivated strike occurred in 1944 caused by operators not wanting to work with black employees, which saw the federal government take direct control of the PTC in order to keep Philadelphia's vital shipyards functional for the Navy. It would be safe to say that the company had a less than stellar reputation by the time the decade came to a close. In came the 1950s, and with it came the meteoric rise of the car and the highways. As ridership declined for public transit services and people moved out to the suburbs in droves, the PTC and its trolleys were firmly entering a crisis point. However, Philly's trolley network would draw attention from an unexpected, though insidious, source. In 1955, the PTC would receive a new majority owner, that being an up-and-coming player in the mass transport scene at the time, a company known as National City Lines. And quickly, this new owner would get to work, citing things such as better flexibility, cheaper operations, especially with one-person operation, whereas a trolley typically needed a driver and a motorman, along with the decrease in ridership due to the suburbanization trend. National City Lines led the PTC to close many of Philly's old trolley routes and replace them with buses. While this was something the PTC was beginning to do in any case, National City Lines would kick this up into high gear. 3/4 of Philly's 45 trolley lines were eliminated between 1954 and 1958, and while some of the routes would see the introduction of trolley buses, or trackless trolleys as we call them around here, this would be a crippling blow to Philly's trolley system, and quite possibly to its transport system more generally. Now, it's worth pointing out here that alongside all the reasons I just mentioned, there was another underlying reason why National City Lines had pushed for bustitution of streetcars so aggressively. And that was simply because National City Lines was heavily backed by none other than General Motors, along with Firestone Tires and the Chevron and Phillips oil companies. And it's also worth noting, this was not the only example of this. In fact, Philly was one of the later cities where National City Lines had done this, since they had been pulling this since the 1930s in cities across the country. The lot of them were even slapped with an antitrust lawsuit for their actions in trying to create a transit monopoly. And they were convicted for it, but the punishment would end up being pretty much just a slap on the wrist. The whole story of the GM streetcar conspiracy is a crazy one in and of itself, and there are definitely content creators that have discussed this matter before. And while National City Lines would only control the PTC for 13 years, they did irreparable damage to Philadelphia's trolley network, and even with a concerted effort to fix it, that would easily take decades to rectify. And it created a very bus-focused mindset for Philadelphia City Transit that even now is having a hard time weaning itself off of. It's now the 1960s, and cities across the country are starting to realize that the private companies that ran them cannot keep their public transport systems afloat for too much longer. The options that they would take to remedy the situation would run the gamut, from doing nothing and let the system die, subsidize the operations of the private companies, or have the municipal or state governments take over the systems outright. Philadelphia would initially opt for the second of these three choices, and a familiar face of today would emerge to make it so. In 1963, the Southeastern Pennsylvania Transportation Authority, or SEPTA, would arrive on the scene to be the entity that provided the state, county, and local subsidies to the region's transit system, from buses to trolleys to subways and commuter trains. Initially coordinating subsidies to the PTC, the Red Arrow Lines, which ran the suburban trolley and bus services, and the Passenger Service Improvement Corporation, which in turn subsidized the commuter trains run by the Pennsylvania and Reading Railroads, By the end of the decade, things had gotten to a point where operating the system under the private companies but with the subsidies was not really working. As such, on September 30th, 1968, SEPTA officially took over operations of the city's public transit services from the PTC, including the 13 trolley lines that remained on the PTC's roster by that time. However, those that may have hoped that SEPTA would restore long-lost trolley lines and reclaim them from the buses would be quickly disappointed, as Route 47, which ran in South Philly, was converted to a bus service in June 1969, less than a year after SEPTA's takeover. Things would not get too much better from here. On the night of October 23, 1975, a fire broke out at SEPTA's trolley car barn at 49th Street and Woodland Avenue, destroying dozens of trolleys and causing a vehicle shortage on their West Philadelphia routes. While service would resume, it quickly became clear that the agency did not have enough trolleys to meet the demand, particularly on the most heavily used trolley lines in the city by that point, the subway surface lines, they being routes 10, 11, 13, 34, and 36. In response, SEPTA placed an order for 112 trolleys built by Kawasaki for their subway surface lines, along with 29 more of them with dual cabs for the two suburban routes, the 101 and the 102, and the trolleys would be delivered between 1981 and 1982, and they continue to see service to this day on both of those parts of the network. With this turn of events, the other remaining trolley lines in Philly had to make do with the 1940s built PCC streetcars, which by the time the new K-car trolleys were delivered consisted of routes 23, 50, 53, 56, 60, and of course our old friend, Route 15. Oh yeah, this was supposed to be about Route 15, sorry buddy. Despite the rugged and iconic nature of the St. Louis Car Company design of the PCCs, age was beginning to catch up to the vehicles, and after the St. Louis Car Company's demise in 1974, spare parts were becoming harder to come by, leading to out-of-service cars being cannibalized for spare parts, exacerbated further by SEPTA's famous chronic budget problems. Throughout the 1980s, the routes 50, 53, and 60 would all be replaced by buses, leaving only the 15, 23, and 56 as the remaining trolley services left outside of the subway surface lines. What ultimately kept these three routes running as long as they did could ultimately be boiled down to how good the services were, where they ran, and what they ran on. The 15, 23, and 56 all ran on high-density, high-demand routes. The Route 15 would run along the busy Girard Avenue. Route 23, once the longest streetcar line in the entire world, ran from Oregon Avenue in South Philly all the way up through Center City and North Philly on 11th and 12th Streets before running up Germantown Avenue to Chestnut Hill. And the 56 would run between Nicetown in North Philly along Erie Avenue and Torresdale Avenue to Tacony in the northeast. In terms of what they ran on, since many of the roads that they ran on were wide avenues and boulevards, oh god, no, not that one! The trolleys were able to have double tracking in the middle of the roadways, as we see here with Route 15, as well as dedicated station stops more akin to what you see on modern light rail systems. In a sense, one could say that the practices of these lines could well have been ahead of their time, and had they stuck around consistently, I would argue that they would be foundational to Philly's trolley renaissance, rather than something that's often been neglected to the point of being unconsidered in Philly's transit landscape. It's therefore a great irony that in 1992, a time when many other North American cities were seeing a trolley renaissance in the form of light rail services, SEPTA would take the complete opposite tack. In late 1992, SEPTA suspended all three of the remaining routes, including Route 15, and replaced them with buses. Initially claiming it was temporary, SEPTA's management seemed to be dead set on making the change permanent, but was restrained from doing so after community backlash. So much so that trolley services on both routes are officially temporarily suspended today, even as the tracks for the 23 rot away on 11th and 12th Streets, and the trolley tracks of the 56, while mostly still there, are being ripped up in places, and in other cases they're being used as left turn lanes, while their dedicated station stops were slowly demolished. For a while, things seemed bleak. Until they weren't. On September 24th, 2005, the Route 15 trolley returned, sporting the same retro PCC streetcars that we see with today's reinstatement. Of course, it's worth pointing out that these are not completely the same vehicles from the day they last left service. From 2001 to 2004, the trolleys were rebuilt almost from the ground up by Brookville Equipment in Brookville, Pennsylvania, the last all-American rolling stock manufacturer left, I'm sad to say. This upgrade equipped the trolleys with regenerative braking systems, air conditioning, and even ADA-accessible doors and lifts, which, in a great twist of irony, means these 1940s vintage streetcars have better disabled accessibility than the 1980s K cars, which have no accessibility functions. Oops. As for the service itself, while there was contention coming from people who lived around the Callow Hill Street Depot regarding parking accessibility, because of course there was, elsewhere along Girard Avenue, the locals were very excited to see it return, and a major beautification project was undertaken by local groups along the trolley's route. On top of that, the tracks themselves were restored between 2001 and 2003 and brought up to more modern light rail standards, and thankfully that update has stood the test of time. While this project was overall a success and has been credited with spurring new developments along Girard Avenue, the project, first announced in 1997, was almost canned outright by SEPTA in 1999, but fierce opposition to the cancellation by transit advocates saw it go through at the 11th hour. It is rather sad to me that SEPTA had to be dragged kicking and screaming to reinstate the service, but in many ways it was indeed a success, even if SEPTA's higher-ups for the longest time were not keen on it, largely for the flimsy reason of having to deal with double-parked cars, which, yes, I know that's a problem in Philly, but overall, flimsy excuse if I'm being honest. Regardless, SEPTA did indeed continue to provide updates to the 15 route, replacing worn-out rails on several occasions in the early 2010s. On the whole, things were looking pretty positive for Route 15, and with the prospect of updates in the 2020s, the 15 had a bright future for the new decade. And then the new decade happened. In January of 2020, SEPTA suspended trolley service on the Route 15 again and replaced it with buses.
Oh shit, here we go again.
They announced that this was due to a reconstruction project on Interstate 95 on the east end of the line, which conveniently also gave them the chance to rebuild the trolleys to bring them up to a state of good repair, as a lot of them were failing inspection, and that the overall project would take a period of about 18 months, which, personally knowing PennDOT's reputation around here, that seemed a bit optimistic to me. But a mere 2 months after this bus substitution began, a thing happened. A really big thing that I'm sure every one of us is painfully familiar with at this point. Safe to say, that highway project would take a bit longer, and we would not see the trolleys return for a similar little bit longer. Now, it would have been insanely easy to be pessimistic about the trolley's return this time, as every time always felt like the last time before. However, there were early signs that SEPTA were getting more serious with restoring the route to trolley use, and more to that, even to expand and improve trolley services in the city. What makes you think that? Well, that would come from the SEPTA Forward initiative, a comprehensive rethink of the major aspects of SEPTA's services that began to take shape around the same time that the thing happened. Among the projects outlined in SEPTA Forward, there were 3 major ones. One was Bus Revolution, a comprehensive rework of SEPTA's bus services, which is frankly deserving of a video in and of itself for all the controversy and delays it has incurred. The second was Reimagining Regional Rail, which suggests great updates to the regional rail services, which is something I alluded to in my Westchester Line video in fact, and is also deserving of its own video too. However, easily the most relevant to this case was the third one, Project Metro, and in particular, one aspect of the project, trolley modernization. I have the documents associated with it linked in the description if you want to read more, but easily the biggest highlight, and the one that everyone was hyped about the most, understandably so, is a new generation of trolleys that are on the way as I speak. On February 23, 2023, SEPTA officially announced that they finalized an $863 million contract with Alstom, the same company that's making the new Acela trains for Amtrak no less, for a fleet of 120 new articulated low-floor trolleys, or trams almost anywhere else, along with, most intriguing for me, an option for 30 more trolleys. These new vehicles, part of Alstom's globally successful Citatis family of trams, will be built at Alstom's North American factory in Hornell, New York, and are expected to be delivered between 2027 and 2030. Those 30 more on offer, though, become more interesting when you consider one of the other things that trolley modernization proposes: extensions of existing services. While most of the extensions mentioned are naturally for the subway surface lines, the most notably extensions to Overbrook Regional Rail Station for Route 10 to connect with the Paoli-Thorndale line, and one of my favorites being the extension of Route 36 to Eastwick Regional Rail Station to connect with the airport line, making that route a vital connection to Philly Airport, which, given the presence of an abandoned loop line and section of track along Island Avenue near Eastwick Station, seems even more possible than some may think. The one that would give the naysayers the biggest pause for thought would be the extensions proposed to Route 15. Yes, you're seeing that right. There's a plan to extend Route 15, or the G line, under this new LA or Denver-esque naming convention they're putting up for the trolleys and the subways. I'm sure this won't cause confusion at all. Nope, not at all. Anyways, the ideas would be to either meet up with the Market Frankfurt L at 63rd Street, or the objectively better option, to send the line along Haverford Avenue to 69th Street Transportation Center in Upper Darby to join with numerous bus lines, the L, the two suburban trolley lines, and the Norristown High-Speed line. Finally, and easily the lesser talked about but just as important as the new vehicles, is the update to trolley operations, and in particular, the implementation of small platforms at stops to allow for level boarding, which would also serve as daylighting for intersections, and thus making both the trolley services better and the interactions safer for cars and pedestrians. This is something that, as we see here, is already a thing in a lot of other places, including on Route 15. And with this update and the elimination of some stops, can see the subway surface lines be brought up to true light rail standards. Now, I think it would be prudent to clarify for those that don't know that there is a difference between services that are streetcars and those that are considered light rail. Streetcars are perhaps the kind of trolley services that people may most be familiar with around here. They stop at every street corner, basically, and they're more often than not run in the middle of regular traffic lanes, shared by cars, trucks, and buses, and have little to no dedicated rights of way as a result. Light rail, though, while using similar vehicles as a streetcar line, do have dedicated rights of way for at least the busiest parts of the route, be it through dedicated trolley lanes that cars are not allowed to use, or by running in their own dedicated lines with minimal to no street interaction at all, as is the case with the Route 101 suburban trolley which runs to Media, which, aside from sections in Upper Darby and its famous run down State Street in Media, runs on its own lines like a regular train does. So, as one can imagine, one of the goals of the updates to the service was to see trolley services become less like a bus on rails and, via dedicated platforms, dedicated lanes, and giving trolleys signal priority at intersections and therefore speeding up service and allowing for a much better riding experience, make the trolleys more of an overall higher order of transit service compared to a bus. Overall, I'm definitely excited for the potential that this project has, and it seems like a lot of people are as well. With a solid start of ordering new vehicles, and they being of a design that facilitates high capacity and great accessibility functions, SEPTA seems to have some wind in their sails on this front. However, there is one thing that still gives me interesting thought. The thoughts of those 30 additional trolleys brings to mind one big idea that I'm sure has caught your mind as well: restoring some of the lost lines. Now, obviously, 30 vehicles would be nowhere near enough to restore all of the lines we once had, but it does allow for opportunities to be had with potential service restoration. In particular, one of the lowest hanging fruit for service restoration for the longest time was here. Route 56, one of the lines lost to us in 1992, alongside the Route 15 and 23, would have been until very recently one of the easiest to restore, and was floated around a few times as such. This was, however, before a more firm decision on its fate was implemented. As mentioned before, Route 56 was one of the lines that stuck around into the 1990s, largely due to its operations and infrastructure. Running along dedicated lanes on Erie Avenue on the busiest section of the line around Broad Street, the trolleys would serve dedicated platforms, all of which were taken down. But despite all else, given the high density and high demand for the 56 route between Nicetown and Tacony, it would have struck me as being one of the easiest to restore, on one of the best roads to restore it on, and the one that makes by far the most sense, since while the bus route still runs in its place, running it as a trolley would make it an order of magnitude better service and improve connections for the people it would serve. However, when I went to Erie Avenue to get footage for this video, I was met with a concerning sight, that of construction vehicles on the trolley tracks, which I found out was a track removal project. As it turned out, in May of 2022, a plan was put in place to remove the tracks in the area as part of a renewal project for the area of the Erie Triangle, where Erie Avenue, Broad Street, and Germantown Avenue meet. And to do this, the section of the trolley tracks around Erie and Broad were to be removed and replaced with dedicated bus lanes and protected cycling lanes. Thankfully, this does mean that the 56 bus will have the potential for service improvements with these dedicated lanes, and anyone who plans cycling around here would have the infrastructure to do so safely. But it is sad that on the eve of a trolley revival a bit further south, a potential line for reinstatement for the longest time is unlikely to see it soon. Which, given the fact that the plan for the bus lanes is to have them on the outer lanes rather than the objectively better choice of putting them in the middle with dedicated BRT stops, and thus leaving this section of the road susceptible to illegal double parking, even by the cops for God's sake, there had better be solutions ready to deal with it. Which, thankfully, because of a new system of ticketing people who park in bus lanes that's being trialed, they seem to at least be trying to fix it. In short, okay idea in principle, but the execution could well lead to its own issues. If you want to delve more into the Route 56 specifically, I'll recommend to you Justin Rosniak of Well There's Your Problem podcast fame, who has a video specifically about this route that I'll link if you're interested. Route 23, though, is a case that's a bit more open for debate about whether a trolley would return or even if it's the best solution. Today, Route 23, once a single route running from Oregon Avenue in South Philly to the Chestnut Hill Loop in, well, Chestnut Hill, a full 14 miles away, is now served by two separate bus routes, with the 23 running the northern portion of the old route and the 45 running the southern portion, with both services connecting to each other in Center City. Perhaps most frustrating of all about the fate of the 23 is that not only can you see the remnants of the old tracks on 11th and 12th Streets here in Center City, but the tracks in Chestnut Hill along Germantown Avenue saw rail replacement work done in 2008, long after any service ever ran, and it's never been used. Now, when it comes to restoring the service, the 23 may be in better shape than most, but that's not saying too terribly much, since not only would we need to restore the rails and the wires, but lay new track. But on the narrow streets of Center City that the line originally ran on, the ever-present issue of cars blocking the tracks, especially for some jerk who decides to double park to get something from the store, you know who you are, have led to advocates to see the service restored as a trolley route, just without the tracks. Yeah, the idea of the line becoming a trolley bus route seems to hold a degree of popularity, especially since it was suggested by a certain local transit YouTuber who's way more famous than me. As much as I appreciate trackless trolleys, it would pain me to see the potential already there go to waste, but ultimately, what works will be what works. This is what a feasibility study that SEPTA is undertaking right now regarding restoring service of the 23 trolley aims to do. And while it's not the highest priority item on SEPTA's totem pole, and I don't think it really should be, it is great to see the dream of trolleys serving places from Chestnut Hill to Reading Terminal to the row homes of South Philly has not died off after parts of the tracks were paved over. But this is not to say that there is no other opportunity. In fact, I can name one that not too terribly many people talk about, maybe only in passing, and honestly, it strikes me as absolutely perfect for a new trolley line, both in terms of infrastructure and sheer location. This is Columbus Boulevard, or Delaware Avenue, or both. Whatever you may call it, it's easily best known as the road serving Penn's Landing and the entirety of Philly's waterfront along the Delaware River. And if you take a walk or even ride your bike on this actually good bicycle infrastructure here, you'll notice that in the median of the road, you'll see train tracks running along here. Historically, these tracks were used to bring freight from the busy docks along the waterfront to rail yards, and further south along Columbus Boulevard, the tracks are still used to serve the industrial complexes of South Philly, as well as serve as extra layover space for CSX's Philadelphia yard near the Marine Terminal. However, with Penn's Landing and its surrounding dockyards seeing major developments along this road, including luxury condos built into the old piers and the Rivers Casino, this is becoming a more appealing place for a trolley route. And it's not unprecedented either. In fact, this was a trolley route at one point, just not one that you may expect to see. Between 1982 and 1996, trolleys did run along these tracks, run by the Buckingham Valley Trolley Association, running an assortment of old vehicles, largely for tourists along Penn's Landing. Sadly though, due to a change in the business demographics of the area and the Penn's Landing Corporation needing the pier that they used for car storage for a future development, the association was forced to end their operations in 1996. But thankfully, most of the trolleys still survive, being on display at the Electric City Trolley Museum in Scranton, Pennsylvania. In the years since, various ideas have popped up for a trolley line along this route, including from the Delaware River Port Authority, which owns the Patco Speed Line for such a service. Without a doubt, there are a lot of challenges to be had, including how a relationship with CSX would work, particularly since the tracks would need to be re-gauged. The tracks that are there now are 4-foot 8.5-inch standard gauge tracks made to run with standard trains on them, whereas for trolleys, they would need to be switched to 5-foot 2.25-inch Pennsylvania trolley gauge, which is used by all trolleys and light rail lines in the state today, since it would allow for the same vehicles to be used and allow for interoperability on other lines. And speaking of other lines, connections with other routes and transit modes would definitely need to be found here. However, there is at least one to note that's easy to connect with as the prospective line approaches Rivers Casino, where Delaware Avenue meets Frankfort Avenue, and the line meets none other than our old friend, the Route 15 trolley. And if the revival of this line is any indicator, it says to me that a lot of things can be possible. Maybe we even see these beautiful old PCCs run along Penn's Landing on heritage trips in the future. Now that's a picture I can't help but love. So where does this leave us today? Well, if you ask me, it leaves us with a lot of potential and hope. And while I have little doubt that we won't be seeing the Philly trolley network of a century ago be restored anytime soon, or at all, projects such as the restoration and extension of Route 15 and the plans in place by SEPTA are legitimately good steps towards moving Philly in a less car-dependent direction. The common thing you'll often see with Philadelphia is that it has some of the best bones to become one of the best cities to live in, not just in the USA, but in all of North America, maybe even the world in some aspects. However, compared to other cities of its approximate size, like Barcelona and Munich, its transport system is definitely lacking. While in many ways it's not lacking in scope and area covered, it's the lacking in that scope translating to good service on some of their highest demand routes and even some of the lesser demanded ones that is really doing it a disservice. In many ways, this could readily be seen with so many of the trolley routes being curtailed and replaced with buses. While there is nothing inherently wrong with buses, especially if they're given infrastructure to make the best use of them, like dedicated lanes and proper bus rapid transit routes on dedicated corridors, buses are very easy to get wrong when dealing with higher capacities, since notoriously they're easier to run without dedicated infrastructure and therefore can provide a weaker service for a cheaper price, in a phenomenon commonly known as BRT creep, with the worst examples being basically just normal buses with fancy paint, less stops, and not too much of a performance benefit compared to rail services. Oh, that's weird. A picture of a SEPTA Boulevard Direct bus just appeared out of nowhere. Weird, I don't remember putting that there. Anyway, ultimately, this did happen to Philadelphia, including in places where trolleys would have been extremely effective. Ultimately, every transport method has a role to play and has a role that it's best at. Walking can get us anywhere, so long as our muscles and will can carry us. Bicycles are fantastic for covering distances that walking couldn't. And then we move to the motorized side of things. Cars and buses can serve pretty much any given street that they can be put on, albeit with a lower capacity and less efficiency on busier routes, especially true with cars. Light rail and streetcars are great at moving higher numbers of people on more major routes with higher speeds. Metro and subway lines provide this to a greater extent with full dedicated rights of way, whether above or below the streets. Commuter and regional rail trains take metros even further with fast connections to surrounding suburbs, towns, and cities. Intercity and high-speed trains kick things up to 11 by running to other metro areas, and planes are best at transcontinental and transoceanic journeys. Heading back down to cities, light rail or trolleys appear to be the missing middle ground in Philly's transport landscape, which is especially sad considering the affection that a lot of people here have for the trolleys. For some, the green and cream PTC colors on a PCC streetcar is an icon of the city, and the fact that some of those trolleys are here, seeing a return of a lost service, can easily be a symbol that the future of Philadelphia can lie in returning to things lost in the past. Other cities have realized this too, and are building out expansive and highly effective light rail systems, almost in the way that Philadelphia used to have. From Seattle to Salt Lake City to Los Angeles, new systems are seeing great expansions and great success, while legacy systems from Boston to Toronto to San Francisco are seeing expansions and updates with great positive effect. There is a reason why light rail has become one of the more desirable modes of public transport in the US, and it largely comes down to light rail being both modern and nostalgic, as well as being an effective mode for almost any kind of rail service in an urban environment, much as they were going back over 100 years. To me, though, it's one of the things that can make the story frustrating too. For as much as Philly has kept a decent amount of its old trolleys around, not much of meaningful effect has been done yet to bring it up to snuff compared to its contemporaries. Personally, I love riding the trolleys whenever I get the chance to, and living in media, I get that chance to with some regularity. They're fast, enjoyable to ride on, even with the rock-hard seats on the subway surface line cars, and they certainly have a nostalgic, albeit boxy air about them that reminds you of some of the great things we had in the past. It is known that nostalgia often makes you remember bad things more fondly by comparing them to the present, but it's easy to be more justified in being nostalgic with Philly's trolleys in my view. However, given the news surrounding Philly's trolleys and SEPTA's overarching goals of modernization and improvement, it seems that Philly is starting to wake up and smell the pretzels when it comes to how to actually improve its transport systems for a modern age. We have a lot to fix, but the fact that those things to fix are more within reach by the day makes me happy. And while I thoroughly enjoy my time riding the old PCCs alongside my dad, a Philadelphia area lifer in his own right, even the most cynical of Philadelphia old-timers would love to see stories like this. The day that these PCCs are finally retired and inevitably restored for heritage trips and museum collections may be a sad one. But with the new Alstom trolleys on the way, the torch could be passed on to a worthy successor, one that can see the Route 15, the subway surface lines, and even the suburban routes into a new age of transportation for the birthplace of America. It will be fascinating indeed to see this story develop, and the saga to make Philly's transport network live up to its potential develop, continuing that long, at times sad, at times hopeful story of how we get around Philly.